The goal of experimental design is always validity. We always want to make sure that the way we design our research is going to produce a result that's legitimate. There are different types of validity. There's internal validity, which means that the experiment measured what it set out to measure. So, for example, if I am looking at the effect of sex education programs on teenage pregnancies, I want to design an experiment where I'm randomly sampling a group of teenagers in a particular school. I'm randomly assigning them to a control or an experimental group. Perhaps our control group has whatever the normal sex education program is. My experimental group is exposed to some kind of new program. And then I obviously have to come up with some type of measure, whether that be, measuring their attitudes towards sex, or their attitudes towards contraception, or their likelihood to use contraception, or maybe I use teen pregnancy statistics as my dependent variable. The bottom line is I have to come up with some kind of way to make sure that what I'm setting out to measure is in fact being measured in the way that I designed my experiment. External validity means that the findings I have can be generalized to situations outside of just the sample that I've studied. So I want to make sure that I sample in a way, and I control for any potential biases, and I control for any other types of variables that might confound or mess up my results, so that I can say what's true of the sample that I studied is true of all of the students at that school as a whole. So we want to make sure that our experimental design is valid, it's legitimate. So how do we do that? In order to make sure that the results of our research are valid, we have to control for different sources of bias. And this might be personal bias on the part of the researcher. The researcher might go in having certain attitudes that affect the outcome of the study. If a researcher is conducting research on whether or not sugar leads to hyperactivity, they might be inclined to do the research and then only pay attention to the results that confirm what they already believe to be true. And we know that that's called confirmation bias. Expectancy bias you saw at work in the video that you watched with the smart rats and the dumb rats. The group of researchers who worked with the rats labeled as smart expected those rats to act differently, even though they were just your run-of-the-mill rats. There wasn't anything special about them, right? It led them to handle the rats in such a way that actually led that group of smart rats to outperform the, quote, dumb rats. And we call these I guess you could say they're kind of an example of what we refer to as demand characteristics. And these are cues, very sometimes subtle cues, like in the case of the rats, just like the way that the rats were handled. These are cues that the experimenter might give to the participants to make the participants believe that they need to produce a certain outcome or they need to exhibit a certain behavior. Participants will then change their behavior to fit the experimenter's expectation. So how do we control for these types of demand characteristics? How do we prevent experimenters from giving the participants these kinds of cues that let them know how they should be acting because of the fact they're in either the control condition or the experimental condition? Ways that we control for bias are by conducting single-blind and double-blind studies. Now, in a single-blind study, participants don't know which treatment group they're in. So I'm going to use the example of a drug trial, okay? So in a drug trial, you have a group that is in the control condition, which is either given a placebo, meaning a sugar pill, or they're given like an older version of a drug. I feel like placebos are used less often than you'd think. Think about somebody who has high blood pressure. They're not going to give that group, one group, a sugar pill that does nothing to help their high blood pressure, right? That would be unethical. So they're likely to give them a commonly used drug in the control group to test it against a newer drug that researchers are hoping to get onto the market, and that would be your experimental group. So we've got our control group receiving the old drug. We've got our experimental group receiving the new drug. In a single blind experiment, participants don't know if they're receiving the old drug or the new drug, or the placebo and the new drug. But in a double-blind study, we're controlling for the expectancy bias of the experimenters by not letting the experimenters know which group is in the control group and which group is in the experimental group. The researchers themselves don't know the researchers who are most closely interacting with the participants don't know which participants are receiving the new drug and which are receiving the old drug or the placebo. Again, the goal of this is to control for demand characteristics. It's to control for experimenters giving any types of cues to the participants about how they expect them to act given the experimental group that they're in. So these types of studies are really common in drug studies, but you actually saw it used also in the facilitated communication therapy video that you watched earlier in the unit. Researchers also have to attempt to control for confounding variables. And these are variables that are not the independent or the dependent variable, but they can influence the outcome of your results. So I also attached a short video on confounding variables, and you can check that out next.